Today we're going to be discussing various aspects of security policies. And at the onset, I would like to mention that I often get asked this question: what is a security policy and why is it important? And my response to that question is that security policies are really rules that we create in organizations, in companies, and in enterprises to help us guide through this whole security management process. A rule is a rule. Now, there are a lot of issues that need to be thought about in terms of rules and compliance and what constitutes a security policy, how we should be designing these security policies. Because more often than not, the analogy I usually use is that you have a wrong rule, that wrong rule is not going to get followed if it really challenges the way in which we have always been working, which really means you're going to have less compliance with a given rule if it does not really fit the need for why that rule was created in the first place. The same thing holds true for security policies. Many a times it just makes sense to create a good security policy, a very foolproof security policy, which means we have to create all these rule structures around security policies which are going to enable us to make an enterprise secure and protect our information resources, to make sure that the business continuity aspects are taken care of and we are able to run our business the way we are supposed to run the business. However, if those rules hinder the way in which we work, the way in which we have always worked, and this is going to vary from one location to another, from one enterprise to another. In certain companies, there are certain ways of working, there are the normative ways of working, and if you disrupt those normative ways of working, you're going to have a problem at your hands in terms of security policy compliance. And that is one of the fundamental reasons why it becomes extremely important for us to design these policies adequately, to think through as to what implications any rule structure is going to have on the way in which we work. Unfortunately, most of the research that is out there on security policies tends to consider a security policy is a sine qua non of a secure organization, which essentially means that they feel that if we have a good security policy and somehow magically it might be we can ensure that people comply with the security policy, we are just going to be fine. I believe that is a wrong route to take. You can create the best possible policy, but there is going to be retaliation. There are going to be people out there who are not going to accept the policy as it exists because it just does not make sense. So it becomes very important for us to go back and look into what people want, what the way in which they work, what's their prevalent culture, what is their norm structure, what are the other rule structures that exist in an organization. Now that is a very important part. The last bit that I talked about is the other rule structure that exist in organizations, because a security policy is not going to stand on its own. It's not going to be implemented in a vacuum. It has to tie back into other policies that exist in an organization. May it be a marketing policy, it may be a human resource policy, may it be your production management policy if you're a manufacturing organization, whatever it might be, your e-commerce policy. So your security policy has to come in and be in sync with all these other policies. Hence, it becomes extremely important again for us to make sure that there is proper alignment between our security policy and what the business is trying to accomplish. Failure to do so is essentially going to mean that people are not going to comply with the security policy. We're going to have a higher chance of violations because of non-compliance, and we're going to have all sorts of other subsequent problems that arise because of a bad policy in the first place. Now, there are two or three facets that need to be thought in terms of security policies. One is the form, what kind of a form it's going to take. Now, in any enterprise, you're going to have different divisions, different functionalities. So clearly, you need to have some functional understanding of the implementation aspects of the policy, which means that if it is email use, then that's what we're going to be talking about in a security policy. If it is web use, if it's social media use, how are we going to be dealing with those issues in a company? Bring your own devices, IoT, Internet of Things, cloud. Those are all different facets that come together to create a robust security policy. So the form of a policy becomes very, very important. What are the ingredients that are going to go into it? The second element is of content. And content is again very important from a security policy perspective, because what is it that's going to come into that particular SAC, which we call security policy? Are we going to talk about procedures? Are we just going to talk about rewards or punishment and so on and so forth? So those are very important things that one needs to consider when a security policy is being formulated. Then finally, it is the impact. The impact aspect of a security policy is really how it changes the work flows and the information flows and how people interact with each other. So any policy, in my mind, in my thinking, has to be bottom up. It has to come from the people. We have to understand what they value most in an enterprise. And once we understand what the values are, those values should define the objectives that should be reflected in a security policy. Once we are able to do so, the policy is going to be easier to accept for a lot of people. So the acceptability aspect is going to be taken care of as a consequence. And people are going to comply with it because it's essentially their policy. It's essentially a reflection of their rules. Now, that's not a static exercise. It has to be thought about time and again and revisited ever so often. If there are violations, there must be some reason why there are violations. I mean, maybe people are ignorant. Maybe people don't like a certain rule. Maybe it hinders their way of working. Now, as work patterns evolve over a period of time, there are going to be things that people are going to be wanting to change in a security policy because either it is not convenient to use or there is some other issue with respect to the context and the domain in which they are operating. So it becomes very important to do a constant evaluation of these security policies and modify them and change them ever so often. At least, I'm not saying 6 months, but I'm saying maybe on an annual basis, you need to have a policy review and make a judgment call as to what rules make sense in a given domain, in a given context, in a given time, and change them if need be. Understand how people react to those rules, and those kind of things are very, very important. I have yet to come across enterprises where there is a constant effort to reevaluate security policy aspects, the content of the policy, I mean, or how people are reacting to security policies. There's very little work in this area at a practical level. Many people don't do this. Many enterprises don't do this, and this is obviously an expensive task to do, but one must recognize that any security policy is a means for a business to succeed. It is an enabler of the business. It is not about a policy being in a vacuum and say, I have a good policy, so I'm going to be secure and I'm going to do my business. A simple denial of a service attack can get an enterprise to get on its knees. It's just going to really, really ensure that the company fails if there's a denial of service attack, because many of these companies, many of these enterprises today are totally dependent on information communication technologies. Any disruption of any sort is going to have an adverse effect on their earnings and how they perform in the business. So it's very important to craft these security policies. I use the word craft, and that's rightly so, because it's not about just the science of doing a security policy and science of making sure that people are going to comply with it. There's an art aspect of creating security policies. How do you bring people together? How do you integrate their different viewpoints and divergent viewpoints and be more inclusive in the formulation of security policy? And that is the critical aspect. And I believe that once security policies get formulated with due consideration to all these aspects that I've touched upon, we will have robust security policies and a much secure environment to operate in as we go forward.